House needs painting, grass needs mowing, where's he at?
Hi, this is Hank. Sorry I missed your call. Leave me your name and your number and I'll get back to you.
He's gone fishing.
Hello and welcome to Off the Water with Hank Parker.
Hello, there you go. You got it right.
All right, with
Proud
my
of you.
beautiful co-host, my granddaughter Sarah Beth. We're reminiscing. This is what I love about getting old. You can look back and look at history. And so we've got some Bassmaster magazines dating all the way back to 1968. This particular model is a 1969. Got my hero, Blake Honeycutt, on the cover when he was just a kid holding some really, really big bass. So we're going to look at the difference between where we are now and where we've come from. And I laugh, and the reason I'm laughing is I look here at Pfluger has got two new troll motor models. Now let's see what magazine this is. This one is not that old. That one goes back to 89. No, is that 79?
No, was it 7?
Yeah, it goes back to 79.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Okay, 1979, Pfluger introduced two new troll motors, M315 that had 15 pounds of thrust. 15 pounds. And then they had a new heavy-duty M320 that had 23 pounds of thrust. Good gracious alive. And now, you know, I got 115 pounds. Amazing. And they were all handheld. You know, you look at the magazines, and a lot of the equipment they're advertising for sale is an extension handle for a handheld.
Yeah.
You know, we converted. It was pretty innovative at the time in the 60s and early 70s. All troll motors that were on the market were transom troll motors. So they would take that transom trolling motor and turn the head around on it and take a piece of steel, have one tooled and a 2x4, and take that transom trolling motor and turn it into a bow troll motor. All you had to do is turn the head around. And then they later came out with some models that already had the head turned in the right direction to mount it on that block on the front of your boat for a bow trolling motor.
Yeah, when I saw that picture and I just showed it to you, honestly, it reminds me of a lot of vacuum cleaners that come out today. I was not expecting it to be so thin.
It is just really incredible. So it's so much fun for me, and it's all familiar with me. You know, I remember all this stuff. And so I'm just flicking through the magazine. Sarah Beth and I are both just looking at the different ads. And Kingfisher Bass Boats, the king of bass boats, they don't exist. They've been out of business for probably 50 years out of Clarksville, Tennessee. Flip tail worms, that was a big thing. But I want you to look at this. There's the hottest golfer in all of America at this particular time. This was like a 1970 Bassmaster magazine. And there's Jack Nicklaus, world's greatest golfer, with a big string of bass with Bob Cobb. Fishing, is it luck or skill? Talking about the expertise of fishing compared to golf. And very, very interesting. And there's Nicklaus showing about the big one that got away. That's pretty cool. But we came a long way, and there's been a lot of changes, and that's what we're talking about today on our little podcast, is the difference between then and now. You know, I look at all these boat ads and articles, and they're all promoting anchor mates. Mm-hmm. An anchor mate was a handle, was a spool with a handle, and the anchor went out off of the front of the boat, and you could turn that handle and winch that anchor up or press a button to release it. Mm. And so every Cadillac bass boat in the early 70s had an anchor mate on the front. So you had a 15-pound anchor that you could crank up. Ooh. And now we just push a button and you got spot lock. You don't need an anchor. there is Blake Honeycutt in a Ranger boat that has stencil on the side. Ranger is spray painted with stencil with Forrest Wood's personal landline telephone number on it, how you can order you a Ranger boat.
Not the spray paint.
Is that
That's
not
funny.
something? I just get so caught up in all this. Here's a famous all-angle casting grip. You can change out the handle on your fishing rod for $5.49. And every rod we're looking at in here has that little short handle, pistol grip, no graphite rods. Everything's fiberglass. Very little option in the way of rods. You didn't see 7-foot rods. You didn't see straight handle rods. You saw pistol grips or little short casting handles, and nothing at all compared to what is popular today. And it's just, to look at all this is just fascinating to me. And you see all these Bagleys, super soft, all that's gone. Flip tails, that's gone. Bagley Super Soft, the only one that still existed and never been out of business, and I didn't know that until this year. Cream Worm Company has never ceased to make baits since the 50s. They've never been out of business. Fascinating. But I go on. There's old Jerry McInnes with a big string of fish. Talking about he caught them on a shimmy gal, a cream shimmy gal.
Shimmy gal.
And there's John Powell in the ad. John was an old Marine, and he retired from the military and became a professional angler. And John's philosophy was he would stick his fishing rod down in the water, and if it was more than 4 guides deep, it was too deep. He was a shallow water worm fisherman, Hall of Famer, loved it, great guy, but how things have changed and how different things are today. Burke, put a Burke where they lurk. Burke's gone. You look at all this whole magazine, and you look at the personalities. Of course, that's Blake on the front. He's passed away. You look at Forrest Wood in the ads. He's passed away. Then you look at Tom Mann in his jelly worm ads. Tom has passed away. You go all the way down this book, and the baits don't exist anymore. They're all gone by the wayside. Mann's is now officially gone. Amazing the difference between then and now. Sarah Beth, I would venture to say that a 5.5 foot, fairly stiff, what we would term in those days as a worm rod, made out of fiberglass, would probably weigh anywhere between a pound and a pound and a half.
Oh, wow.
I mean, probably at the lightest, it'd be 10 ounces. That would be at the very, very lightest. But what we would call a worm grade rod, something stiff enough to set the hook with plastic worm, probably weigh a pound.
A pound. What are they today? Like
5
what
ounces, 4 ounces,
Oh, wow.
6 ounces at the, and they're 7 foot long versus 5.5. You know, a 5.5 foot glass rod with the technology and the way they're wrapped. I work with Lew's, and it's amazing to me the strength that is in these little bitty rods, and it's the way the graphite is overlaid and wrapped that makes them so incredibly strong. But a 5.5 foot rod probably wouldn't weigh more than 4 or 5 ounces.
Wow.
And so Lou Childers in the early days were all thinking the stiffer, the stronger, the harder you jerk, the more penetration you get. And when you're fishing a plastic worm, the trick is to get that Texas rig worm, get that hook through the worm and in the fish's mouth. And we're all thinking somewhere around 15, 20 pounds of pressure. Well, when you start reading and putting scales with meters on them, where when you jerk, you're really only generating about 3 or 4 pounds of pressure. And you're trying to, I remember an article in the Bassmaster magazine. I've said this before, and I hate to be redundant, but you try to break the boat seat. Again, then everybody sat down. We had swivel seats. You sat down to fish. You didn't stand up. Today, nobody sits down. It's then and now. Then you sit down. So the article said you try to break the boat seat. You jerk hard enough that you break the boat seat to set the hook.
I like then. Let's go back to then. I like
Yeah,
sitting.
you like sitting down. Well, then Lou Childers came along and said, no, guys, it's not about how much muscle you put behind it. It's how much speed you generate. So everything Lou was talking about speed stick, speed spool. Anytime you remove mass, you increase sensitivity. Anytime you remove mass, you increase speed. And all that was a big part of the philosophy that Lou Childers had on hook sets and on feel. You feel more when you remove mass. It's more sensitive. But Lou came up with the idea of like cracking a whip. And you could set the hook and generate 7 or 8 pounds of pressure, whereas when you were trying to muscle it with those big, heavy rods, you were only getting 3 or 4 pounds.
Have you found that to be true?
Absolutely, 100%. It is amazing how effortless it is today with the rods we have to get a good hook set compared to the way it was then.
Right.
Then you had to really wind down, point that rod, and come back with a big sweep with all the horsepower you had to offer to get a hook set, and it'd still jump and come off half the time.
Oh, man.
So it's a whole lot different now than it was then. And so it's interesting, the development. So let's slow down. Let's take it a little bit at a time. And let's talk about what it takes to be effective with a fishing rod. We'll talk about line. We'll talk about reels. We'll talk about lures. We'll talk about hooks. We'll talk about the whole makeup of selecting a plastic worm, lead versus tungsten. It's amazing where we are today compared to where we came from.
Yeah.
In just, I'll say a few short years, it's been 52 years or so since that magazine was published, which has been a while. But I was there when they published that magazine, and I remember. And I saw the story on page 14 of this particular spring edition of the Bassmaster magazine on my buddy Blake Honeycutt. And we talk about plastic worm fisherman. Plastic worm fishing. He was a plastic worm fisherman, and he was good at it. So now, then, how do you fish a plastic worm? Well, first of all, if we had known what we know now, we would have all had 7.5 foot rods. We would have all had graphite if that material was available, but it wasn't, and we didn't, and nor did we know. So now we got a 5.5 foot rod. So we got a 5.5 foot rod, and the selection of hooks were limited. There were no chemically sharpened hooks. Everything was sharpened. So one thing that you had to carry in your boat was a file.
So you had to sharpen your own
Sharpen
hooks.
your own hooks, and you had to make sure that they were sharp. And hooks were not as easy to come by then as they were now, so you didn't cut that hook off and drop it down in the bottom of the boat and put on another one. You sharpened that bad boy.
So what I'm hearing is that we kind of have it easy nowadays than back then. You don't have to do all that. I feel like I'm getting lectured. Well, you think your day's bad? I had to walk through the hurricane to get to school. I was 12 years old working my job. I had to stand on a little box to wash dishes.
My dad used to tell me he had to walk to school in the snow, and it was uphill both ways.
Exactly.
Going and coming.
Exactly.
He lived in South Georgia. I don't think it ever snowed. Oh, it's pitiful.
Oh, man.
But that's kind of the way it honestly was. We're not embellishing or exaggerating. You had to have a file, so you wanted to file that hook and make sure that hook was sharp. And I would always test it on scratching my thumbnail. if I couldn't scratch my thumbnail with a little bit of pressure, my hook wasn't sharp enough. So I'd sharpen it some more. And I'd make sure I'd run that thing across my thumbnail and make sure it would penetrate my thumbnail, and then it was sharp enough. So now you take that plastic worm and you rig it up Texas style. The reason you rig it up Texas style is it makes it more weedless, and you can fish it through that brush pile without hanging up. But now you got to come through all that plastic plus get in that fish's mouth. So what did you do with that 5.5 foot rod when you got a bite? You pointed the rod and extended your arms as far as you could extend your arms and point that rod straight at that fish, and then you brought your arms to your chest and to go up as high as you possibly could go, all in one sweeping motion to get the hook through that fish's mouth.
That's a lot of work.
It was a lot. And if you were fishing with say a half-ounce weight, fishing 15, 20 foot of water, then it's a chunk of lead, man. Mm-hmm. So you jerk that fish's mouth open with that lead. Now you got tungsten, and it's so low profile, it's not that big a deal. But that was a pretty big deal back in the way it was.
Back in your day.
Back in my day, back in my era, back in when I started.
Prime.
So it's pretty amazing. We had glass rods, slow to respond. We had a limited selection of premium fishing line, and it was all monofilament. There were a few people back in the day that used some sort of braided or line that was not monofilament, but the vast majority had evolved, and the premium fishing line of the 70s was Berkeley Trilene and DuPont Strand. And those were the two lines of choice. Shakespeare had some line. There was a Bearcat. There were Cortland. There were a couple of different brands, but the two primary bass lines were Trilene and Strand. Strand was an extruded nylon 6. I'm not sure exactly what the makeup was at Berkeley in the early days. They were nylon 6 as well for a while, but then they went to a tripolymer. But all of them had 20 to 25% stretch. I mean, we didn't have the choices and the selections and the low stretch and the fluorocarbons that we have today. So when you're setting that hook, you've got to allow for that stretch in that line. So it was a lot to catching fish on a plastic worm that made it more difficult than it is today. Today we take a 7-foot rod, we take fluorocarbon line, we take a small tungsten weight and a chemically sharpened hook, and boom, we're in the money, buddy.
There you go.
So
Set up for you.
then and now is a lot different with a plastic worm versus now versus then. So that's the way it was with a rod selection. Reels, there were only a handful of casting reels available, and there were no low-profile reels. You know, I used an old round reel that probably weighed 14, 15 ounces. The vast majority of the reels I use today are low-profile lues that weigh 6, 7 ounces or less. I've got one model that weighs 4.5 ounces, the lightest casting reel available, low profile. Again, remove mass, increase sensitivity, increase response. So we didn't have the reel choices. So we didn't have the line choices. You had all that stretch to deal with. You had glass rods that weighed a ton, 5.5 foot, 6 foot was a long rod. Very few people had 6-foot rods, but as time went on, the rods got longer and longer and longer. Now we fish with a lot of 8-foot rods.
Science and innovation, baby.
It makes a difference. So we talked about the boats. The boats, 100 horsepower. When I first started fishing, the biggest outboard Mercury made was, I think they made a 125 the year I started really getting into buying my first boat. My first boat did not have a Mercury outboard. I had a Brand X. I had so much trouble out of it. The last 50 boats I've had have all had Mercuries. I love Mercury outboards. They have been so good to me. I've had so little problems with them. I turn the key or push the button as I do now. I got a key fob on my Ranger boat, and so I just push a button and it fires up, and it's reliable, dependable, fuel efficient, and it's a well-performing and I think a sleek, good-looking engine. So I'm a pro Mercury guy.
Yeah.
And I look back through these magazines and I see all different brands of outboards that most of them have gone by the wayside. They don't exist anymore.
Right.
So time has changed the way we look at boats, motors. I told you earlier, all of them had anchor mates where you had anchors on the front. That's all history. There were no shallow water anchors, no Talons, no Raptors, no poles. They were clean transoms with just an outboard on the back. Some of them in the early days had a troll motor. They'd put a troll motor on the bow and a troll motor on the transom. So you had dual trolling motors. Wow.
Wow, I don't get too fancy now.
Yeah, and the guys would sit down in the back and they'd coordinate their effort. That way you had 20 pounds of thrust. If you had two going, you had 40 pounds of thrust.
Oh, wow.
Get out of town, man. We somebody. We're going fishing. So that covers the boats, the motors, the rods, the reels, the hooks, the line. And so now we're going to talk about the baits.
All right.
The bait selection in 1970 was so few compared to where we are today. I mean, you had a limited number of baits. You look at a bait like a tool to do a job. So you want a bait that will allow you to fish whatever structure you're trying to fish effectively. You want the right color, you want the right transparency, you want the right vibration, you want the right rattle. You want all the above. But in 1970, you didn't have that as an option. Now today, it's an overload. It's exactly the opposite problem. In the old days, you would scramble around and you would try to envision, what if I had this bait? Well, what if I could design a bait that would do this? What if I had this? You didn't have it.
Right.
And today, you look at such an array of tackle out there, you don't know exactly where to start because you're overwhelmed with all the choices.
Yeah, I'd say for a beginner, it's like, okay, where do I start?
Yeah.
You know?
So that is a huge difference between then and now. And you look at the way fishing was promoted in 1970, most of the lure manufacturers, the rod and reel manufacturers, the boat manufacturers, most of those guys depended on outdoor riders for their publicity, for their influence, and for a marketing effort. They would go to, let's say Bob Cobb was in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and he wrote for a magazine there before coming, or a newspaper. They go to different newspaper sports writers, and they use them to help promote their products. For example, if Larry Mayer was at the Columbia Record in the South Carolina Record in Columbia, South Carolina, they would give Larry Mayer whatever he needed in the way of baits and rods and reels to write articles about their product.
Early day influencers.
And that's the way the whole marketing program worked. Well, then all of a sudden, Ray Scott got his group of guys, and they started fishing Bass Angler Sportsman Society. It was a changing of guards. All of a sudden, the Bill Dances of the world, which there ain't but one, so I shouldn't say that, the professional fishermen of the world, with Bill Dance leading the way, Billy Westmoreland and Roland Martin and Bobby Murray, and not too far behind them came Rick Clunn and Larry Nixon, and all these guys became the primary influencers of how to buy fishing tackle because they were experts. They had credentials. They had proven themselves to be worthy of having influence on the market because of their knowledge, because of their success in the competition. So things changed dramatically. Okay, so now we look through these old magazines and we see all these articles. And I start reading, and it would be funny. I've got one here that is the pros tell how to choose and use fishing tackle. They have Paul Elias, and he's talking about crankbaits. You have Denny Breyer on rods. You have Rick Clunn on reels. You have Larry Nixon on jigs. You have Tommy Martin on worms. And you have Hank Parker on spinnerbaits. And I start reading these, and I wonder if Larry still feels the same way today as he did when he talked about jigs in 1985. I wonder if Tommy feels the same way about worms, and Denny about rods, and Paul and on crankbaits, and Ricky on reels.
How you feel about those spinnerbaits?
Well,
Still hold
as I
true?
read that article, it's still pretty much the same philosophies that I had on spinnerbaits. I became, I don't know, my whole spinnerbait deal goes back to I was a big, giant Blake Honeycutt fan, and I looked at these 6 and 7 pound bass that he had in this picture as a little boy. I never caught a 5 pounder in my life. Man, and I was 16 years old, and I wanted to catch a 5 pound bass. Well, I met a guy named Key Biggers. He was from Charlotte, North Carolina, and he fished a spinnerbait that was made by Dan Sloan called a Zorro Aggravator. And this thing had a big old tail on it, the rubber tail that you put on the back of it looked like a chicken's foot. And he said, man, this is what you need to catch that 5 pounder.
Yeah.
And so I got me some. Matter of fact, he gave me one. He gave me a yellow one. Yellow and black and yellow, that was the big colors. And so I got a Zorro Aggravator, and I caught my first 5 pound bass, so I fell in love with spinnerbaits. That was my first 5 pound bass I ever caught in my life. I caught on a Zorro Aggravator. And that's the same bait that Bobby Murray won the first Classic on in 1971. Stan Sloan, a deputy sheriff from, former deputy sheriff of Nashville, Tennessee, who started Zorro Bait Company, came out with that aggravator. Well, as I progressed in fishing, I kept looking at that bait, and it had like 50,000th wire. So it didn't offer a lot of vibration because it was so stiff. And I thought, man, what would it be like if you could adjust this down and get a lighter wire where that arm would actually vibrate, and you could get way more vibration out of it than the way it is now. So I just started building on that. Well, what if this hook was at a different angle? I miss a lot of fish. This arm comes back too far. It's too stiff. This hook is not at the right angle. What if this head was shaped? So I started working on spinnerbaits early on. And then I met a guy named Bill Morgan who had Hog Collar Bait Company in North Carolina. And Bill and I would talk for hours about how to refine spinnerbaits and how to make them more flash and more vibration and to have a better hook set. And he and I didn't see exactly the same, but we saw a lot alike, and we worked together, and we built some very unique baits. Actually, that's where the Classic spinnerbait was birthed. It was originally a bait that I had Bill Morgan hand pour me on the jig, and then I would finish them off and put the blades in the beads and separate. So little things make a big difference. The separation in the blades, with the beads, the clevis, the Sampo swivel that you use, and the thickness, the weight of the blade. The heavier the blade is, the better it turns. It doesn't take as much resistance. So I had all that pretty much figured out by 1985. So my article is pretty accurate. There's a few things that I would change and state different than, but I read Ricky's article on reels. I'm sure he's got a lot of different ideas, and Denny on rods. I know he's got some different ideas, and Paul Elias would tell you a whole lot different about a crankbait today than he did in 1985. So pretty interesting how all that changes, and it was the hot techniques and the hot tactics. And I think the one thing that people have to realize is how we progress and how we've learned from each other and how the sport has developed what they have today in the way of technology because of all the information that was passed on from angler to angler and generation to generation. So there's so much more knowledge. I used to tell people all the time, tournament fishermen are more knowledgeable than people that don't fish tournaments. And they would say, no, I don't agree with that. I think there's some great fishermen that never fish a tournament and you'll never know who they are. I said, hold on, wait a minute. I didn't say that. I didn't say that tournament fishermen are better fishermen. I said they're more knowledgeable.
Right.
And if you and your partner fish together all the time, either he's the best fisherman in the world and you're the second best, or you're the best and he's the second best.
Right.
Because that's all you know.
Right.
And so that's your mindset. And so you go out and fish on a lake and you think, well, they're not biting today. It was a bluebird day and fish just were not biting. And you come back in and you believe that till you go to the scales and there's Nixon up there with 40 pounds of fish. Well, you realize they were biting if you would have known what you do. So now you know what did not work for you in those days that you fished, and you find out what did work for Larry.
Right.
So you get knowledge. And that has been passed on. And that knowledge has gone from then to now across the board in rods, in reels, in line, in hooks, in lures, in boats, in outboards. You know, that's the one thing that I've always admired about Mercury. They want your input. They want to know, well, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? Well, let's try this prop. We've designed a new line of props. I want you to run them. I want your feedback. And so they continue to meet the demands of the fishermen. You know, it's awful easy for an outboard company to be arrogant and say, we don't need your input. We build the world's greatest outboards. But that's never been the philosophy of Mercury. They've always wanted to know, well, what could we do with our outboards that would make it a better product to service what you do as a fisherman, not as a water skier,
Right.
not as a pleasure boater, but as a fisherman. What could we do?
That is probably one of the smartest things that they've ever done for their business and for their product, to tweak it to what the customer wants. That's going to cause more sales. You know,
And I think they
seeing that
realize
difference.
that.
Yeah.
And it makes it
Absolutely.
for a better experience for the fishermen. So
Right.
all of that has evolved. And so then when all this started, especially you go back to this 1968 handbook, and it was about 50 horsepower tiller handle outboards. It was about bow-mounted troll motors, and a bow-mounted troll motor is like trying to push a rope. It just don't work, man. You can't control that boat. Transom, I'm sorry, I said bow. Transom mount troll motor is like pushing a rope. You cannot control that boat running it from the transom. A bow is the way to go. And I remember when I first went, and I may get in trouble for saying this, the first time I ever went to Mankato, Minnesota, and met with at that time, Warren Tenney, the president of Minn Kota Trolling Motors, he told me that transom mount troll motors were where it was at. He was in the walleye market and things were good, and he did not see this bow idea, all these foot control troll motors. He didn't see that going much further. And
Boy, were you wrong.
he was wrong on that one. And I said, sir, I honestly believe you're missing it. This thing is going to be more and more foot pedals, more and more bow drives than transom. And I promise you it's a changing of the guards. He didn't see it then. Wasn't but 2 years later, I went back for the same meeting, and they wanted to know more about, all right, what length shaft do we need? How long should the cable be? What should be the angle of the foot pedal? I mean, they were into it. And Minn Kota never, ever looked back. When they made that commitment to make that bow mount foot control troll motor, they made a full Nest T plunge and went for it. But that's the changes that were made. I mean, and that was some of the battles within the industry is, hey, I know you're in the walleye market. I know you're in the saltwater market. I know you're in the trout market. But hey, this bass fishing thing is going to be bigger than all of those. The bass market is coming alive. This Ray Scott guy in Montgomery, Alabama is for real. This Bass Angler Sportsman Society is going to be like the PGA is for golf for fishing. It's coming. It's about bass, man. Come on. And it was hard to convince the industry that bass was going to be the premier species and that the tournaments were going to be as big a deal as they are today.
I could see that. Makes sense.
So it was a lot of changes. So we sat here and looked through all these magazines we talk about then and now. Man, it was so much. And I look at the personalities. I look at Billy Westmoreland. Billy Westmoreland was from Tennessee, and he fished Dale Hollow Reservoir, and he was a smallmouth expert. He was a largemouth expert as well. But Billy had all these different philosophies that varied from all these other anglers.
Wow.
And then you take a Jack Haynes, a guy from Texas, and who won the 1975 Bassmaster Classic, and his philosophies differed from Billy's. And then you take Al Linder, who came from Brainerd, Minnesota, and Al had a whole different look at how methods and techniques should work for catching smallmouth and largemouth in Minnesota versus Jack in Texas or Billy in Tennessee.
So I have a question. If you know the answer, how did they decide the largemouth bass to be the fish?
He was more
The
available.
species.
He was in more people's backyard than any other species. I love smallmouth fishing because I've never really had the opportunity to fish for them as a kid. They were not in my backyard. Largemouth are everywhere. They're in everybody's backyard. They were available, and that's why that became the premier sport fish,
Okay.
is their availability.
Okay. Makes sense.
Yeah, and they're just such a keen fish and such a sporty fish that they're worthy of all the attention that they get, in my opinion. But when you take all these guys, you took Jack from Texas and Billy from Tennessee and Al from Minnesota, and you start bringing all these ideas together. Well, I learned something that I did not know from Al. Well, I learned something I did not know from Billy. I learned something from Jack Haynes. I learned from all these different anglers, and now we're melting these ideas. We're having a big melting pot in this bass world. So everybody's learning techniques that are different. And so all of a sudden, the whole industry starts to catch on. Man, these guys need longer rods. Then graphite came along. Well, when graphite came along, that changed the whole rod world. Lou Childers did more to change the rod world than anybody when he came up with the idea of speed and removing weight mass. As far as I know, the first single leg guide I ever saw was on a Lou's speed stick. And you thought, that ain't gonna save much weight. Oh, how wrong was I? That changed a lot about that rod because you didn't have to have double wrapping. You didn't have to, you removed all that weight from putting the coating on the wrapping and having double wraps. And plus, it's about an inch span between the two legs on the guides that changed the general action of that rod. So you had a single leg guide, it changed a lot of things that I didn't even realize. Well, all those little things make big differences, and people started learning from it. Well, then the industry starts saying, wait a minute, this whole bass thing is for real. Bass is going to be the premier sport. It's going to be the premier fish. And this Bass Angler Sportsman Society, this Ray Scott guy started, is going to be the PGA of fishing. And so let's get behind it. So that's how it just started melting. And you look here, you got a little seminar handbook. It turned into a big production, a television show, turned into a big magazine with memberships of over 600,000. Things started coming together. So you start looking at then where we are now. Look at all the products that are dedicated. Look at all the companies. Look at all the innovation. It's dedicated and driven by bass. Not just Bass Angler Sportsman Society, but by the species. There is a tournament on almost any weekend on almost every lake in this country. Whether it be a high school tournament, a collegiate tournament, a club tournament, a local tournament, an open tournament, an elite tournament, a Major League Fishing tournament, an FLW tournament. There is a tournament somewhere every weekend on nearly every lake. That's how popular it has become. Some people get upset with that, and some people love that. It's just part of what it is, and that's how this thing has developed. The result of that is all these changes. And why it is so incredible and magnificent is because of the personalities that's involved. Stan Sloan, who was from Nashville that developed that Zora, he was just a brilliant mind in designing baits. He would think about, boy, we need this right here. He made a space buzzer that was the dangest buzz bait I've ever seen. I'd love to get my hands on them. So if you listen to this podcast, you got some of those old Bass Buster space buzzers. They were developed by Stan Sloan. I'd sure like to know about it because I'll buy them from you. I'd love to have some of those. It made the best noise of any buzz bait. But he was just an innovator. Then you have Tom Mann, who's so innovative in his ideas, made the Little George, made all kind of crankbaits and soft plastic baits. You had all these guys and different personalities, and they all came together. And it became very competitive. So everybody wanted to one up on the other and design a better lure. We're the beneficiaries of that.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever have a hard time with people telling you, oh, bass fishing isn't a real sport, this isn't ever going to go anywhere? Did you have a hard time?
You should stand before a man who you want to marry his daughter and tell him you're going to be a professional fisherman. Yeah, I heard it real good. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard of. So, yeah, I know all about that. But it wasn't taken real serious in 1970. Mm-hmm. But it was taken very serious 5 years later in 1975. It became a big deal. Mm-hmm. In 1980, it was a giant deal. In 1990, it was a bigger deal. Mm-hmm. In 2000, it was even a bigger deal.
This keeps growing.
It is not slowed down.
That's
it's
good
a
for
bigger
the sport.
deal today than it was then.
Yeah.
That's why it's so cool to look back at then and now. It is so cool to think about and have the simplicity of all the designs of the lures, of the rods, the reels, and how complex it is today. Look at the electronics. Good gracious alive.
Absolutely.
Electronic maps, a chip, a little SD chip you put into, and you have a Lake Master map.
I'm just waiting for the AI to start invading the bass boat world. Yeah, good luck trying to learn that.
I'm overwhelmed. That's way beyond my pay grade. I cannot imagine where all that's going. All this artificial intelligence is scary to me, so I hope it doesn't invade our sport, but I'm sure it will, but I'm not ready for it. I can promise you that. But just what we have today versus what we had then, to watch how things have changed. Just think about having an anchor on your boat, and you had to let out all this line, and they designed all these different types of anchors and rubber coated them where they wouldn't skin up your fiberglass boat, and then they put smaller cords on them that were stronger, and you could even use steel cable that were coated with rubber, and to try and reduce the diameter where the water wouldn't, the rope wouldn't offer too much resistance against the water. And all that was big innovations at the time. That's child's play. Now you just push a button and you hit anchor on your trolling motor.
Just wait for it. You're gonna get the "Hey Siri, take me to this spot on the lake."
Oh no, oh no! I'm hoping Siri don't get involved. She'd probably be a pretty good fisherman.
She might be recalculating.
Yeah, Rika, she helps me out a lot. She does not understand my Southern accent.
I don't understand your Southern accent sometimes.
Do you think I have an accent?
Oh Lord, yeah.
I thought everybody else had one. I didn't realize I have one. But if you want to talk like me, all you got to do is put a little bit of super bubble in your mouth, and you can sound like I do.
Oh yeah.
But it's so much fun to look back, and so the innovation that we've had has been because of personalities. It has primarily been because of Ray Scott and Forrest Wood, the vision that they had, the camaraderie that they had, and how they worked together to build it. And then Helen Sevier picked it up when Ray sold out Bass to her, and then Irwin Jacobs came along with the idea of FLW and built the Forrest Wood Cup. And now Major League Fishing is a huge player. I love to watch them on TV. I love to watch these guys under the gun and under the pressure. I know how that feels, and so it's really fun to observe that and watch how much pressure they get under and the decisions they make under pressure. But to really summarize it all, it goes back to the dream that Ray had, putting it together, and the foundation that it was built on with the effort of Ray and Forrest, and where it is today because of Irwin and because of Major League Fishing and the guys that have continued to keep bass on the same level that Ray built it, the same foundation. And it's an incredible sport, but it's a lot different now than it was then. And I've been there through it all. I've watched all this transition and innovation and all this extreme development in electronics. It is amazing where we are. But what is more amazing is where we were, where we came from, the beginning, the early years. How in the world did all this happen? And it's so good to look back and think back and talk about the good old days. But the good old days are still good in the world of bass fishing.
Absolutely. I'd say so. I mean, honestly, I think it's something people should educate themselves on. Like where the sport came from, what you had to do back in the day, and maybe they could understand where you're coming from more, seeing some of this new technology come into the sport and be introduced. I mean, it's a huge change. So
It is. And I look back, Sarah Beth, and I prioritized, I wanted to be a world champion. I really wanted to win every tournament I ever fished. I really wanted to make my mark on this world and in this sport. But now as I look back and reflect, as I look through these magazines, it's exciting, but it's sad. I look back and I see a picture of Billy Westmoreland, and he's no longer with us. I look at Ray, and Ray's gone. I look at Tom Mann, and what a great friend, Tom's gone. I look back at Forrest, the person that had the more influence on me than any other sponsor that I ever had, and he's gone. I look back at Burke Bedell, and he's gone. So it's sad, but the memories that I have are way more important. The people that I have met through this sport mean way more to me than all the trophies that I ever got. They mean more than all the money that I ever was able to make. And it is people that have made this sport so wonderful. And it's different today. Kids are somewhat different today. But different doesn't mean bad. They're just different. And so they're going to look back just as I am when they get through 50 years of their career, and they're going to see the exact same thing that I see. It was the people. It was all about the people. It was the relationships. It was the opportunity to make new friends and to grow. And collectively, when we love each other, we work together, we respect each other, we have a favorable growth to a favorable sport, and it takes care of itself. That's my objective, is to contribute to the people who may not know the history of the sport, to enlighten them a little bit about the way it was then and the way it is now. And it's very interesting to me, and I hope I can verbalize it in a way that people can vision how I saw it and how I was a part of it and how it really was then
Yeah.
and how it is now.
Oh, yeah. I think that's covered a lot of it. I'm sure there's plenty more. But, I mean, even just for me hearing it, I mean, I'm not in the bass world other than just knowing the stuff that you've done. There's a lot to learn. And it makes me understand a little bit more. Like what I said earlier, where you're coming from, you know, you really were at the very base point of the sport.
It's a great place to have been, and I'm in a great place now. And I just want everybody to understand that loves to fish, how it's evolved and how special it is, and not to take it all for granted. It didn't just happen. It's a method to the madness that gave us the rods and reels and the technology and the fishing line and all the things that we have today. There was a formulation that made that work, and it's all right here in the history and the archives. I intended to take one magazine and just start going ad by ad, article by article, and I find that fascinating. I may do that on another podcast because it's just so amazing to read these articles and how different it is. I won't say obsolete, but how different it is, how much more advanced it is today than it was 50 years ago in 1970.
Right.
It is so different, and it is far more technical. Today, the articles were so simple, and today it's very complex.
Very. I'd agree with that.
So it's a lot different now than it was then. It's all good.
It's all good.
Sarah Beth, I appreciate you sitting in, and I'm really bad to dominate. I feel bad that we don't interact a little more, and I get more of her feedback. But you know, your mama got me a T-shirt that says I'm talking and I can't shut up.
Hey,
So,
that's the whole family. I was like, if you want me to talk, I can talk now. I mean, all of us.
yeah, that's a good thing. I got all this history in my mind, and I can't wait to spit it out. So I just tend to get the ball and run with it. So I apologize for that, but I sure appreciate you sitting in and contributing and try to keep me straight. I know that's a hard job. But,
I enjoy listening.
well, I sure appreciate it, and I appreciate everybody that's a part. And hit that subscribe button. We need you to subscribe. That's a big deal to us. And I guess you can tell them goodbye.
Goodbye. See you guys next week. And don't forget that we have the links to the high school fishing forums in the description box below, and another link to Huckleberry Apparel.
That's good. Well, I appreciate you reminding us of that, but we do appreciate you very much listening or watching, whichever or both. And we'll be back maybe next week. And we appreciate you. And I will say God bless you. And I'll see you next time. I'm Hank Parker.
The house needs painting, the grass needs mowing. Where's he at?
Hi, this is Hank. Sorry I missed your call. Leave me your name and your number and I'll get back to you.
He's gone fishing.